The morning sun filtered through the poorly adjusted blinds of Eric's small apartment, illuminating the cramped space he called home. The wheelchair sat beside the bed, a constant reminder of the life he had never planned for but had learned to accept. He sat on the edge of the mattress, carefully adjusting the position of his feet, a movement that had become automatic. Physical therapy had taught him the importance of protecting every part of his body, even those he could no longer feel. In the corner of the apartment, a small desk housed his creative world, papers scribbled with detailed clothing sketches, an old sewing machine that still worked with effort, and fabric scraps he bought on clearance. Design had been his passion since his teenage years, a love that only grew stronger when he began working as an apprentice at a local studio. He still remembered his former mentor's words, "The best design isn't about what you create, it's about how you make someone feel." But all of that seemed so distant now. Eric sighed as he rolled over to the desk. He opened his laptop and started his morning routine of checking emails from companies he'd sent resumes to. It was the same story, polite automated responses or, worse, no reply at all. He tried to ignore the familiar pang of disappointment as he thought of Emily, his physical therapist. "You're a talent wasted at home, Eric," she had said during their last session. "Don't let the wheelchair define what you can or cannot do." She always knew what to say to ignite a spark in him. Emily was more than a physical therapist, she was a friend who had supported him since the accident, encouraging him to stay active both physically and emotionally. But at that moment, even with her optimism ringing in his mind, Eric felt trapped. The accident had happened 2 years ago, on an ordinary night. Eric was riding his motorcycle home after a long day at the studio when a car suddenly switched lanes without signaling, forcing another vehicle to hit Eric. The impact threw him onto the asphalt. The pain and despair of that moment still haunted him, but what hurt most was the hit-and-run driver who caused the crash. He never found out who it was. Never had a face to blame. Life since then had been a mix of adaptations and challenges. Most of the time, Eric tried to focus on what he still had, his hands, his mind, and his passion for design. He did small sewing jobs for neighbors and sold accessories online, but he knew he could do more. He just needed a chance. That afternoon, Emily arrived for an unexpected visit. She carried a bag full of flyers, as she often did, hoping to find something that might inspire him. "Have you ever thought about working in a clothing store?" she asked, flipping through one of the papers. Eric raised an eyebrow. "I've tried. They don't hire someone who can't even reach the top racks." Emily rolled her eyes, placing the flyers on his desk. "Maybe, but you're more than that. Look at these things you create." She picked up one of the detailed sketches Eric had left on the desk. "This is incredible. You just need a chance to show what you can do." He gave a forced smile. "Easy to say when you're not in the chair. And easy to give up when you are," she countered, her tone gentle but firm. "Try again. Not for them, but for you." Eric looked at the papers, feeling the familiar mix of doubt and hope. Among the flyers, something caught his eye, a job posting at a luxury clothing store called Hayes Couture. They were looking for an assistant to help with design and customer service. It wasn't the ideal job, but it seemed close enough to his passion. "Okay," he said, picking up the phone. "I'll try." Emily smiled, satisfied. "That's what I'm talking about." That night, Eric sent his resume and, as always, attached a few of his sketches. He knew there were thousands of other applicants, but at that moment, he decided to believe that maybe, this time, it would be different. And he was right. The next morning, an email from the store arrived, inviting him for an interview. It was the first positive response in months. "They want to see me," he told Emily, holding the phone with a surprised smile. "Then go and show them who you are," she replied confidently. Eric knew he still had a long way to go, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was moving, if only toward the unknown. The day of the interview arrived faster than Eric expected. He found himself adjusting his shirt repeatedly in the mirror, trying to decide if he looked professional enough. Emily insisted he take some of his best sketches as a portfolio, and he finally gave in, putting them into a simple but organized folder. "You're going to nail this," Emily said, smiling encouragingly as she helped him straighten his shirt collar. "Or I'll be dismissed in 5 minutes," Eric replied, a faint smile escaping his lips. "They won't know what hit them," she said, handing him the folder. "Now go and show them who you are." Hayes Couture was a stark contrast to Eric's modest apartment. Located on a bustling corner, its glass facade reflected the shine of the displays, showcasing impeccably tailored dresses and luxury accessories. Eric took a deep breath as he approached the entrance, feeling the weight of expectations, both his own and those who believed in him. Inside, the atmosphere was one of sophistication and calculated silence, interrupted only by the sound of heels echoing on the marble floor. A young blonde woman behind the counter looked up at him, her eyes widening momentarily before softening into a hesitant smile. "Hi. You must be Eric," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Sophie." Eric shook her hand, noticing her nervous but friendly energy. "Nice to meet you." "Margaret will see you in a minute," Sophie said, gesturing for him to wait. "I work here as a sales associate. And, if you need help with anything, just let me know." Before he could respond, a firm voice interrupted. "Sophie, stop dawdling." Eric turned to see an older woman with short gray hair, wearing an elegant blazer that seemed to command immediate respect. "I'm Martha," she said, crossing her arms. "I'm the head seamstress here. Let's see if you can keep up." Eric didn't have time to reply before Martha walked away, muttering something about dress alterations. Sophie gave him an apologetic look and murmured, "She's like that with everyone." The tension in the air increased when Margaret Hayes appeared. Tall, slender, and impeccably dressed, she exuded a cold authority. Her eyes assessed Eric quickly, as if deciding whether he was a good idea before even speaking. She offered a polite but distant smile and led him to a small office in the back. "So, Eric," Margaret began, crossing her legs as she skimmed through the resume he had sent. "Tell me why you think you belong in my store." Eric took a deep breath. "I've always been passionate about design. Before the accident, I was an apprentice in a studio. And even after, I kept creating. I don't think I belong here because of my wheelchair, but because of what I can bring." He slid his folder of sketches toward her. Margaret raised an eyebrow but picked up the folder, flipping through it with a neutral expression. There were sketches of dresses, suits, and even casual pieces, each one showcasing his skill and creativity. "You're talented," Margaret admitted, closing the folder. "But this job requires more than just talent. How do you plan to handle the physical challenges of this environment?" Eric swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the question. "I won't lie. It'll be a challenge. But I'm used to adapting. I always find a way." Margaret remained silent for a moment, her eyes fixed on him. Finally, she stood up. "Sophie, please show Eric the workspace." Sophie led Eric to the back of the store, where clothes were altered and designs were made. He noticed the meticulous organization but also the lack of warmth in the space. Martha was there, measuring fabrics and throwing quick glances in their direction. "You sketch well," she said abruptly. "But let's see how you do with a needle and thread." Before he could respond, Sophie intervened, excitedly. "You're going to love working here. It's busy but thrilling." Eric smiled, but before he could reply, Margaret entered the room, her heels clicking on the floor. "You start tomorrow. Be here at 8. And, Eric, I want to see what you can do." It was hard to tell if it was a compliment or a challenge, but he just nodded. "Thank you. I won't disappoint you." As he left the store, excitement began to build in his chest. He finally had a chance. Even though he didn't know exactly what Margaret expected, he was determined to prove that she hadn't made a mistake in hiring him. Margaret Hayes wasn't the kind of woman who tolerated failure. Every piece, every detail in her store was a reflection of the vision she had built with steady hands and sacrifices few would dare to make. Early on, she learned that the world didn't forgive weaknesses, especially for women who dared to be ambitious. Hayes Couture, with its elegant displays and polished wooden furniture, was more than a business, it was a symbol of her determination. Every customer who entered, every garment that left, carried a piece of her soul. But lately, it felt as though her soul was being torn apart. The store, once vibrant, now felt too quiet, sales were declining, the halls echoing with emptiness. Seated in her office, Margaret stared at the sales charts projected on her laptop screen. The downward lines seemed to mock her struggle to keep the business relevant. She glanced up at the store's display windows, where mannequins exuded an almost unattainable sophistication. Too unattainable, she thought, but pushed the idea aside. Admitting that her target audience was disappearing would be admitting defeat. Margaret grew up in a small town, the daughter of a tailor who spent his evenings crafting bespoke suits for local men. Her mother, a teacher, insisted she focus on her studies, but Margaret was captivated by the sound of scissors cutting through fabric and the way her father transformed simple materials into something powerful. He used to say, "Every stitch tells a story. You have to listen to the fabric before you create." But Margaret wanted more than simple stories. She wanted the world. She left town at 19, determined to conquer New York's fashion market. She worked as an assistant in a major department store, enduring humiliations, long hours, and the constant feeling that she was never good enough. But Margaret wasn't one to give up. When she had saved enough, she opened her own shop, a small space in an unassuming neighborhood. There, she began crafting garments that defied conventions, elegant, modern, yet always exclusive. Hayes Couture quickly gained notoriety. Celebrities frequented the shop, influencers posed with her designs, and Margaret's reputation grew with each fashion show. She became known as a visionary, but her rise wasn't without sacrifice. Broken friendships, abandoned relationships, and sleepless nights were the price she paid for success. The problem was that Margaret had stopped listening to the fabric. Over time, her impeccable instinct for trends began to falter. Stores like Logan Cooper's emerged, offering not only modern and affordable clothing but also a shopping experience that emotionally connected with customers. Margaret believed her brand's exclusivity was enough, but the numbers told a different story. That morning, while Martha adjusted a piece in the atelier, Margaret walked in, her heels echoing on the hardwood floor. Martha glanced up at her over her glasses, pinning a dress in place. "Let me guess, another plan to save the store? If you'd rather watch this store fail, you're free to leave now," Margaret shot back without hesitation. Martha sighed, accustomed to Margaret's relentless determination. "It's not about giving up. It's about accepting that the audience has changed. We're no longer what they want." Margaret ignored the comment. She knew Martha was right, but admitting it was inconceivable. Her thoughts turned to Eric. Hiring him had been almost impulsive, but now it seemed more than just a practical choice, it felt strategic. He could become the new face of the store, a symbol of inclusion, something that would attract attention and headlines. That afternoon, Margaret attended a local fashion event where she crossed paths with Logan Cooper, the young and cocky owner of a chain of stores seemingly everywhere. Logan was everything Margaret despised, casual, expansive, and superficial. But he had what she needed, customers. "Margaret," Logan said, approaching her with a champagne glass in hand. "It's been a while since I've seen you at one of these. Still keeping the store active?" Margaret forced a smile. "Still serving clients who know good taste. And you? Have you traded quality for quantity yet, or are you still trying?" Logan laughed, the sound dripping with condescension. "You know, Margaret, innovation isn't a crime. Maybe one day you'll figure that out. If you need tips, I'm always around." She clenched her jaw but maintained her composure. Logan was an annoying reminder that her store was falling behind, but also a motivation. She couldn't fail. Not after everything she'd sacrificed. That night, Margaret revisited Eric's sketches once more. To her surprise, she found herself intrigued by the creativity and functionality of his designs. He could create clothing that was elegant yet accessible, something she hadn't done since the early years of her career. But it didn't matter. To Margaret, Eric was a marketing opportunity, a piece in a larger game. His talent was a bonus, nothing more. The next morning, she called Sophie and Martha into a meeting. "I want to feature Eric on the store's social media," she said, adjusting her glasses. "He's barely started," Martha retorted, crossing her arms. "You want to turn him into a symbol before you even know what he can actually do?" "He's already a symbol," Margaret replied curtly. "We just need to make sure people know it." Sophie hesitated but nodded, while Martha stared at her skeptically. "I hope you know what you're doing, Margaret," the seamstress said before leaving the room. Margaret was left alone, staring out of her office window. She knew she was walking a fine line between reinvention and desperation, but that's how she had always lived. There was no room for error. Eric didn't know it, but he was her last gamble. Eric woke up before dawn in his small apartment, setting his alarm clock to ensure he wouldn't be late. The wheelchair sat beside his bed, waiting as always. He maneuvered into it with practiced ease, though the usual tightness in his chest reminded him that this was the start of a routine he had never chosen. But today was different. Today he wasn't just surviving. He had something to prove. When he rolled through the store's doors, he felt the weight of stairs. Sophie was the first to approach him, smiling widely and trying to ease the tension. "Welcome to the team," she said with an enthusiasm that felt slightly nervous. Eric thanked her, adjusting the folder of sketches on his lap. He looked around, absorbing the environment. The store was immaculate, cold, like an art gallery, but carried an undeniable sophistication. Martha walked past him brusquely, muttering a curt good morning while balancing a stack of fabrics in her arms. Margaret appeared shortly after, her heels clicking against the marble floor. She looked at Eric with a neutral expression, assessing him like she would a garment, deciding whether it was worthy of her window display. "Let's see what you can do," she said before turning and walking away, leaving Eric alone with Sophie and Martha. "She's like that," Sophie said quietly, trying to be reassuring. Eric simply nodded, feeling the growing pressure. He knew Margaret didn't expect much from him, and Martha seemed inclined to confirm it. This was his chance to change that. The first few days were challenging. Martha gave him repetitive tasks, hemming skirts and fixing minor errors, but Eric approached each one with patience. He knew he had to earn her trust. Sophie, on the other hand, was eager to help, asking questions about his sketches and even suggesting he share some ideas with Margaret. "She doesn't seem like the type to be easily impressed," Eric said as he adjusted a blazer on a mannequin. "You never know," Sophie replied. "Besides, what do you have to lose?" Eric's first moment of victory came a few days later when Mr. Caldwell, a regular customer, tried on a jacket Eric had altered. "This is excellent," Caldwell declared, glancing at Margaret. "This young man has talent." Margaret, who had been observing the interaction from a distance, approached with her usual reserved demeanor. "Good work," she said in a tone devoid of emotion, but clear enough for Eric to notice she had taken note. It was a small gesture, but for Eric, it was a starting point. The sewing machine's hum filled the atelier, a steady, familiar melody Eric had come to appreciate. He was working on one of his projects when Margaret entered, her stride firm, her immaculate posture unchanged. But today, there was something different in her gaze. She seemed tense, as if carrying a burden. Eric looked up as she approached, her expression more focused and critical than usual. She stopped beside him, observing the piece he was working on, a straight-line dress with a simple yet sophisticated cut that contrasted with the store's more extravagant designs. "You have an incredible talent, Eric," she said, her voice contemplative. "I've started to realize that later than I should have." Eric, surprised by the tone of her voice, turned his eyes toward her. "I don't understand. What's changed?" Margaret hesitated, as if searching for the right words. She stared at the dress for a few more moments before speaking again. "A lot has changed, Eric. This store, my vision, the way I see life. Even you." She took a deep breath, as though preparing for something difficult. Eric felt a growing unease in the pit of his stomach. Is something going on, Margaret? You seem different. She smiled faintly, but it was distant, like a mask. I'm trying to understand what happened. What really happened? And you have something to do with it. Eric frowned, confused. Me? What does this have to do with me? Margaret stepped back slightly, walking slowly to the store's window. The soft afternoon light streamed through the glass, illuminating the elegant space but also reflecting the loneliness she felt. She turned around and looked directly at Eric. You've never asked how I got my store, how I made it here, have you? She asked, her voice firm but tinged with emotion. I got here at a price. Many prices. And I never fully accepted what it cost. Eric, uncomfortable, averted his gaze, unsure of where the conversation was headed. Margaret walked over to the work table, picking up one of Eric's sketches. She studied it for a moment, as if searching for answers there, and then, suddenly, she said, I was responsible for the accident that put you in that wheelchair, Eric. Her confession hit like a punch to the gut. Eric looked at her, eyes wide, his mind racing to process her words. What? No. That can't be. Margaret met his shocked gaze with an expression of deep regret. Yes. The accident. It was my fault. I was on a New Jersey highway, driving to an event, and I was distracted by a phone call. I cut into the lane without realizing you were coming. You fell off your motorcycle. The car that caused the accident fled, and I never knew it was you. I never knew you were on that road. Eric sat in stunned silence, the shock coursing through his body. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Memories of the accident flooded his mind, the pain, the chaos, the unfairness of it all. And now, he had a face to associate with it, Margaret's. Margaret took a hesitant step forward, her eyes filled with remorse. I felt it, Eric, but I never did anything. I didn't know how to face it. The feeling of anger began to rise in Eric, but he suppressed it. He knew he was at an emotional crossroads. The confusion, the pain, the urge to shout. Yet, deep down, he also realized that anger wouldn't bring back what he'd lost. And what do you expect me to do with this? He asked, his voice low but heavy with hurt. Margaret stepped closer, cautious. I want to make amends somehow. I can't go back in time, but I can do something. I want to help you. Pay for your treatments, offer whatever support you need. I'm not trying to fix it, Eric. I'm trying to do something I couldn't do before. Eric looked at her, the anger slowly ebbing as he considered her words. The pain was still there, but he also felt something new, a glimmer of understanding. Life wasn't just about the mistakes people made, but about how they chose to address them. I don't know what you expect from me, Margaret, he said, his voice still rough. Do you think money will erase what happened? Do you think I want to be the victim in this story? Margaret didn't respond immediately. She knew he was right, that no amount of money could undo the damage. But what she was offering wasn't a solution, it was a step toward making things right, something she hadn't been able to do before. I'm not saying it will erase anything. But I can do something good. I can help you. And maybe, together, we can do more than just exist here, she said, her voice softer now. Eric remained silent, her words echoing in his mind. Accepting help from someone who had hurt him was difficult, but perhaps this was the step he needed to finally move forward. He took a deep breath. I accept your help. But not for me. For you. So you can sleep at night knowing you did something right. Margaret nodded, her expression softening for the first time in years. Thank you, Eric. They stood in silence for a moment, the tension between them slowly dissipating, replaced by a quiet understanding. It was the beginning of something new. Something that, perhaps, could heal both of them. The rehabilitation center had a clinical air, but the sounds of laughter and footsteps echoed down the halls, creating a vibrant and hopeful atmosphere. Eric felt the familiar mix of anxiety and anticipation as he adjusted himself in his wheelchair, waiting for his therapy session. Beside him, Margaret sat in a plastic chair. It was strange to see her outside her usual environment, stripped of the sophistication she carried like armor. Instead, she looked almost vulnerable, as if still trying to find her footing in this new role of supporter. "Are you sure you want to stay?" Eric asked, casting her a curious glance. Margaret straightened her posture, as though the question had caught her off guard. "Yes. I want to see this up close. I want to understand what you go through." Eric gave her a small but sincere smile. "Okay. Just don't judge me if I make faces of pain." Margaret returned a brief but genuine smile, something that had become more common in recent weeks. Before they could continue, Emily, Eric's physical therapist, appeared at the doorway. "Eric. Time to get to work," she said cheerfully, glancing curiously at Margaret. "I see you brought company today." "She's the boss," Eric replied with a shrug. "And, apparently, my new official cheerleader." Emily smiled and extended her hand toward Margaret. "It's nice to see a boss who cares." "I'm Emily, Eric's physical therapist." "Margaret Hayes," Margaret said, shaking her hand. "It's a pleasure to meet you. Eric speaks very highly of you." "I hope he does," Emily said with a laugh. "He's one of my most dedicated and stubborn patients." Eric's determination during his therapy sessions mirrored his approach to life, steady, deliberate, and focused. Margaret, watching from the sidelines, began to understand the depth of the challenges he faced. These small victories, lifting a leg, bearing weight for a few moments, were monumental in a way she had never truly grasped. Margaret's presence became a new source of motivation for Eric. And, in return, watching his progress became a revelation for Margaret, showing her not just the strength of his resolve but also the potential for her own transformation. As the weeks went by, both Eric and Margaret made steady progress. Eric began to gain strength in his legs, moving them more autonomously and even starting to use a standing aid for short periods. Each achievement, no matter how small, was celebrated by Emily with enthusiasm and by Margaret in her more reserved but quietly supportive manner. Meanwhile, the store also began to thrive. Eric's innovative designs, paired with Margaret's new, more inclusive approach to the business, began attracting a more diverse and loyal clientele. Sophie grew more confident than ever, spearheading sales projects and promoting Eric's designs on social media. Even Martha, though still pragmatic and blunt, worked alongside Eric with a mutual respect that hadn't existed before. Margaret spent more time in the atelier, collaborating with Eric and learning from him. One evening, as they were both adjusting a dress together, Margaret said something that surprised both of them. "You've brought life back to this place, Eric. Not just to the store but to me." Eric, focused on the fabric in front of him, looked up at her in surprise. "I think you're exaggerating." "I'm not," Margaret replied with sincerity. "I didn't realize how much I'd lost until you showed up." One afternoon, after a particularly rigorous therapy session, Emily pulled Margaret aside. "I want you to know that Eric's progress isn't typical," Emily said, her tone serious. "He's responding incredibly well to the treatment, but what's driving him most is the support he gets. You're a big part of that." Margaret stood silently for a moment, absorbing Emily's words. She had never seen herself as someone who inspired or supported others. She had always been the relentless, demanding woman who expected the best without giving much in return. But Eric had taught her there was strength in vulnerability, in genuinely connecting with others. "I just want him to have the chances I didn't give before," Margaret said, her voice softer than usual. "He deserves all of this." Emily nodded, smiling. "And so do you. In a way, it seems like you're helping each other grow." Not long after, Eric reached a significant milestone. With the help of crutches, he managed to walk a short distance without his wheelchair. Margaret was there, along with Emily, as he took those first steps. Eric's smile was contagious, and for the first time in years, Margaret laughed, a genuine laugh. "I told you I'd make faces of pain," Eric joked as he sat back down. Margaret chuckled, something rare and heartfelt. "I never thought I'd say this, but you surprise me every day." "And you surprise me too," Eric replied with a grin. As Eric's physical progress continued, so did Margaret's transformation. She began prioritizing the people around her, both in the store and beyond. Customers started noticing the difference, commenting on how the store now felt more welcoming and authentic. One day, Mr. Caldwell, the loyal client, made an observation that stayed with Margaret. "Your store has never been better, Margaret. It feels like you finally found balance." And he was right. For the first time, Margaret wasn't chasing an unattainable ideal. She was building something real alongside the people who trusted her. The room buzzed with life. Conversations mingled with the clinking of champagne glasses and the soft rhythm of background music. The gallery walls were adorned with stunning designs, each telling its own story, all bearing the name of a rising star in the fashion world, Eric Fletcher. Eric stood upright, leaning on his crutches, a subtle but proud smile on his face as he greeted guests. He still used his wheelchair during moments of fatigue, but the progress he had made over the past weeks symbolized his resilience and the support he had received along the way. Across the room, Margaret stood watching, a quiet pride evident in her expression. Dressed in a sleek black gown, she seemed transformed, no longer the cold, calculating woman of months past. Her eyes shone with a newfound light, a reflection of someone who had finally learned to value human connection as much as success. "You've got something special here, Margaret," Mr. Caldwell said, standing beside her with a glass of champagne in hand. "I hope you know that." She smiled, glancing toward Eric. "I do. And I wouldn't have it if it weren't for him." The evening marked a milestone not just for Eric but for everyone involved. Sophie, more confident than ever, chatted with journalists about Eric's influence on the store and the fashion world. Martha, now a vocal supporter of Eric, spoke to a group about the collaborations that had transformed the atelier. "He's brought a freshness we haven't seen in years," Martha said with a genuine smile. "And honestly, he's brought that to all of us." Emily, Eric's physical therapist, arrived later, carrying a bouquet to congratulate him. "I told you you'd go far," she teased, handing him the flowers. Eric laughed, accepting them with gratitude. "You also told me I was stubborn. And I think that helped." "More than you know," Emily replied with a grin. As the night wound down, Eric found Margaret near one of the displays, where one of his pieces was prominently featured. He approached her, still holding his crutches. "So, what do you think?" he asked, gesturing toward the piece. "I think you deserve all of this and more," Margaret said, her voice sincere. "You're not just a talented designer, Eric. You're the soul of this store now. You've brought something I didn't even realize was missing." Eric smiled, looking at her with gratitude. "And you gave me a chance when no one else did. Even if the reasons at first weren't great, you've become a big part of how I got here." Margaret took a deep breath, her expression contemplative. "I know I can never undo what happened, Eric. But I hope that, somehow, what we're building now shows how much you've changed everything, for me, for the store, for everyone." Eric nodded slowly. "You've already shown that. And I think that's enough." Later that night, as the last guests departed, Margaret lingered in the gallery, her eyes on one of Eric's designs in the window. It was a simple creation but full of symbolism, a blazer with lines that represented imperfections, yet together, they formed something harmonious. It was the perfect metaphor for everything they had experienced. She watched as Eric left with Sophie and Martha, laughing at something Sophie had said. For a moment, Margaret felt a peace she hadn't known in years. It wasn't just about the store or success anymore. It was about the people she had learned to value. As the gallery lights dimmed, Margaret smiled to herself. What had started as an attempt to save her business had turned into something far greater, a chance to save herself. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, leave a comment, and check out our next story.